there, Internet people. Welcome back to another Tiny Desk sermon. We have a chance to look at the text for the upcoming Sunday, and this coming Sunday is the day of Pentecost. Pentecost literally means 50 days, and it originally was a Jewish festival that came 50 days after Passover, and it was a festival, originally a sort of a harvest type festival, but then became a celebration of the giving of the law at Sinai, which is of course connected to Passover. It's all one story. In our case, Pentecost is 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus. So it's an interesting thing that we get this connection to the Jewish observation, but now connected to the resurrection of Christ and the giving of the Spirit, which of course is what Pentecost is all about. Now, my job every year, in part, is to help us listen to the Pentecost story and what it actually says versus kind of what we've been told it says or what our imaginations think it says. I'm not going to pay any attention right now to the John reading. We've heard part of the same reading a few weeks ago, but it's about Jesus promising that in his absence he will send the Spirit, the Advocate, to be with the church. So let's take a look at Acts. Now this reading is always the either favorite or most fearful reading for lectors to read because of all the place names in it. Acts 2. When the day of Pentecost had come, now again, when it says the day of Pentecost had come, it's referring to the Jewish festival. The apostles were all together in one place, and suddenly, from heaven, there came a sound, like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues, as of fire, appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all of these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and the residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea, and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. All right. It's quite an interesting and dramatic reading. Let's walk through it a little bit and try to bring some clarity to what we hear, and then think about what it might mean for us. So again, Day of Pentecost has come. It's the Jewish festival of Pentecost, and they're in Jerusalem. So it's the center of the ritual and celebration life of the Jewish people. Suddenly from heaven there came a sound, like the rush of a violent wind. What comes is a sound, not a wind. But it sounds like the rushing of a violent wind. It's sort of like that sound you would hear on a television audio when it wasn't tuned to anything and you had all the black and white dots on the screen. It's white noise, which is that sense of a whole bunch of noise that makes a sound that is incomprehensible. So there's no wind at Pentecost, but there's a sound like a violent wind. And the sound fills the whole house. Now, we hear next what that sound is. Divided tongues appeared. So this sound is the sound of all these languages being spoken at once. And at first, it's white noise. Divided tongues, as of fire. So it doesn't say fire appeared over them. It says divided tongues, like fire. If you imagine a tongue wagging in the air, it could look like a flame of fire, a tongue of fire. And a tongue rested on each one of them. Why? Not because they need fire, but because they need to be empowered to speak the languages of the people around them. So this is all about sound and language, and the Holy Spirit empowering the church to be able to speak in every language the good news. So the Spirit empowers the church. They didn't take a online class to learn languages. They are Spirit empowered and able to do this amazing thing. So then there are Jews from every nation living in Jerusalem. Let me show you a map. These are all the places that the reading from Acts names. And you can see they stretch from northern Africa up to Italy, all through the Asia Minor, into the Middle East, and down up until around to Egypt. So, first of all, this is all the places where the diaspora Jewish population was living, and others. But it's where people may have been born in Phrygia and were raised in the native language of Phrygia. And then they moved to Jerusalem, a very cosmopolitan city with Jews from all over the world living there. So their native tongue was whatever land they came from. So you can see what the text is trying to imply with that map. Now, back to the text. They're living in Jerusalem. They're coming out to celebrate the festival. And notice that at this sound, the crowd gathered. So the sound that we heard in the first paragraph is what draws people in to check it out. And everyone is hearing the disciples, the early church, speaking in their native language. Now, what's significant about that is throughout that world that I just showed you on the map, there was a universal language. It was Greek. And for whatever historical reasons, Greek had become the language of the Roman Empire. Not Latin. Latin was already a dead language. Greek was the sort of universal language of the Roman Empire and of this region. It's why the New Testament is written in Greek and not in Aramaic or other local languages. It was the way you communicated to a broader audience. But in this scene, instead of the disciples just coming out and speaking in Greek, in the language of the empire, they speak in the native tongue of each person. There has to be something significant about this. And I think there are at least two significant things about it. One is it is a Spirit-empowered enactment of everything that Luke has been saying in Luke's Gospel, and now Luke is writing Acts, about God forming a community out of the great diversity of humanity to be one community in Christ. So we have now, at the early stage of the church, the Spirit-empowered enactment of that vision. And it's happening because of the languages that can be spoken now to people from their homeland. Not Greek, their native language. Now, the other reason is, the other reason I think this story is significant, is there's a big difference between hearing something in your native language and hearing something in a language that's secondary to you, especially one that perhaps has been imposed on you by an empire. So if you are you grow up in one country, move to another, your native language, or as I think it's meaningful to call it, your mother tongue, is the language of your heart. It's the language that speaks most directly and deeply to you because it is your mother tongue. It's as I've said before, it's the tongue that your mother spoke while you were in her womb. It's the tongue that shaped you as an infant. It's the language that helps make you who you are. It's wonderful to know all kinds of languages, but everyone has a mother tongue. Some people grow up sort of bilingual, but there's some language that has a deep resonance with you. So, in this story, for the church to be empowered to speak to people in their mother tongue about the good news of Jesus rather than the language of the empire means they're speaking kind of directly to people's hearts, to their true identity, affirming their native language and their place of origin, and not requiring people to give up their identity to be included. That is certainly a significant reading of this text for our time. How we, whether it's through using language or other ways of communicating the gospel that are culturally sensitive and significant, how we as a whole church include all people in the good news. Now, that doesn't mean that every congregation has to speak every language. We should not forget that the church is a vast, diverse community all around the world, speaking all the languages of the people of the world, and therefore including all peoples of the world. Even just in the United States, we have churches probably speaking almost every language of the world, or at least many, many of them, whether they're Native American churches where they're able to maintain their native language, or churches of Hispanic background where Spanish is the preferred language and the mother tongue of the people there. The church does this. Now, it can be important and very meaningful for a congregation to explore ways to speak the good news in another language other than the dominant language of that community. So in the United States, that means churches that are English speaking um, can contemplate how the Spirit might be empowering them to do ministry in the language or the culture or a meaningful way of connecting with people who are not part of that dominant culture or language. That's a very tricky thing to explore. It can't really be done by people of the dominant culture and language thinking they know how to do it. It has to be done in partnership with people of the other culture or language. But it's something that congregations in some places and times have explored and have been able to do very interesting ministries. Sometimes it's difficult to create one community out of the two separate language communities, but those two communities can kind of exist and worship and be in fellowship side by side. I often ponder, given how close we are in the center of Austin to both the Texas State School for the Blind and the Texas State School for the Deaf, and the unique languages and ways of communicating that each of those communities needs. And there probably aren't many churches that are able to do this. And so I often wonder what could we do to embrace those other languages and cultures as a expression of affirmation. You don't have to give that up to become part of us. We honor that. It's who you are, and it's a valid way to be church and to speak the good news. Let me see what else is going on in this text that might be interesting. There's something else I was going to say. Yes, that's what it is. The joke about being drunk. So what's happening is so bizarre, and people are doing things that are strange, that one reaction of the crowd is, these people must be drunk to be acting this way. Peter says, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. They're not drunk yet. But they are drunk on the Spirit. And so I like this notion of the intoxication of the Spirit, being drunk on the intimate connection to God that the Spirit brings, and the empowerment to bring good news to everyone. That's an intoxication. It's something that changes our behavior and makes us look strange to other people, but helps us live in line with the vision of the New Testament of what the gospel is all about. So I love that imagery. It's humorous, but I think it's also kind of a meaningful thing to connect to. What does it mean not to be drunk on alcohol, but drunk on the Spirit as God's church? And then, two things I have to say. One, it's often important to clarify what's happening in this story versus what's happening in other parts of the New Testament where Paul talks about people speaking in tongues. This is not that. This Acts story is not about speaking in tongues. It's about speaking in languages that are discernible and understandable directly. When Paul talks about glossolalia, which is the word for speaking in tongues, he means somebody who has some sort of spirit infused moment, and they have these sort of unintelligible utterances that is no language, and it takes a second person to interpret what they're saying, according to Paul, for it to be intelligible. So that's a whole different issue, and Paul has questions about that and whether it's something that's helpful or not for the church. He's not saying it doesn't happen, but he's questioning whether it's really helpful for the unity of the church for people to put too much into that realm. But that is not what Acts is about. Acts is about a different kind of spirit-empowered speech, which is immediately intelligible to the people who are hearing their mother tongue. I see Lois has commented. LCMS had a church for the deaf here in Austin at one time. It may still be viable. It was in South Austin. Yeah, and I think at one point Holy Cross had some sort of sign language ministry. I'd be curious to know what other churches there are for the deaf community to be connected to, and how they do that in their worship in particular, but also in other means. It's fascinating now how the technology we have, all of us and most of us in our direct possession, can transform the possibilities for communicating with people who are deaf. And when we live stream, we turn on the closed captioned. Maybe I forgot to turn that on for this broadcast. But we can turn on the closed caption so that a person who cannot hear can see on the screen what is being said. So I've often thought that's one. It's a great outreach for people who are watching live stream to be able to understand what's going on if they can't hear. But also, somebody could actually be sitting right in the sanctuary and have the live stream on their device and see the live text as it happens. Now, there's a bit of a delay, so it won't be immediately what's happening, but for most things that isn't as important. But so it fascinates me how persons can make use of the technology we have, which is amazing. And oh, good, thank you, Lois. I guess I don't see it while I'm doing it. Lois is getting the closed caption on the screen. Good, glad to see it. And of course, the closed captioning is not always correct. Sometimes it does some weird things with words when it can't quite understand what the speaker is saying. All right, so this Sunday we will make everything red. It's the color of the day. Only 2 days a year we have red. And we will celebrate the way the Spirit empowers the church to be a church that connects with all peoples of all nations, all languages, all ethnicities, to be one community without giving up all that diversity. That's the key thing. Our weekly email that went out today announces a new class I'm going to start in a few weeks on Zoom, so take a look at that. And this Sunday is also our emphasis on supporting HBCUs, particularly Houston, Tillotson, and Austin, as a way to honor our now deceased, dearly beloved members, Mel and Zeta Sykes. So we will have a time after worship, especially, to talk about that and encourage everyone, if they want to donate to Houston Tillotson, to do that. So I hope to see you soon, and I'll be back next week with another Tiny Desk, and we'll see what happens next. Peace.